Welcome everyone to our 2022 John Gissendanner Memorial Lecture in African and African American Studies. My name is Don Morgs. I'm the Director of African and African American Studies and Professor of Political Science. And I just want to welcome you all. I really appreciate you coming out in person or virtually for those of you who are online watching us through Zoom. We've tried to hold this lecture just about every year for the last 11 years or so. I think we may have missed just one. And this is a really important event to us because we do it in honor of our late colleague, John Gissendanner, who was a longtime member of the English department, one-time Director of African and African American Studies, and a persistent supporter and promoter of African and African American Studies on campus. We still remember and reminisce about John, and so this is an opportunity for us to remember the impact he had on Towson's campus. I would like to acknowledge just a few people in the room. Dr. Cindy Gissendanner, okay. John's spouse. And we've got some faculty in the room as well as, I'm not going to say who's not here. We're not saying that. But I do want to acknowledge also the retired faculty who are either here in person or online virtually through Zoom. I know a lot of those folks were excited about the event. So without I want to get to introducing our speaker, but let me say that after this lecture, we will have a light reception on the second floor of the Liberal Arts Building, in the little walk, the atrium, is it called? The foyer. You know, as you're walking back to Towson Town Garage, you'll walk past our little reception. So please join us for a few minutes and for some food. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening. We are so fortunate to have with us Professor Martha S. Jones. She is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a Professor of the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. I should say that, strangely, usually the folks that we invite, we have some kind of personal connection or someone knows someone, but I got excited. I read an article about Dr. Jones, and I said, oh, you know, and I saw she's at Hopkins. Maybe she'll come. So I reached out, I cold called her, and she accepted the invitation. So I'm really excited about that. Professor Jones is the author of Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, which was selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books for 2020. Her 2018 book, Birthright Citizens: A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, was winner of the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award, the best book in civil rights history. It was the winner of the American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize for the best book in American legal history. The American Society for Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award for the best book in Anglo-American legal history. So she's an award-winning author. When we said she was an award-winning author, we meant it. She is also the author of All Bound Up Together, the Women Question in African American, All Bound Up Together, the Women Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, and a co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, published in 2015, along with many other articles and essays. Professor Jones is a public historian, writing for a broader audiences at the New York Times, Washington Post, through the Atlantic, the USA Today, and a number of other publications, periodicals. She is an exhibition curator for the Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation exhibits at the William L. Clements Library, and an expert consultant for museum, film, and video productions with the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, et cetera, et cetera. So Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law, which bestowed upon her the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa in 2019. Prior to her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work as a Charles H. Revson Fellow on the future of the city of New York at Columbia University. Professor Jones is an immediate past president of the Berkshire Conference of Women's Historians, and today serves on the boards of the Society of American Historians, the National Women's History Museum, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, the Johns Hopkins University Press, the Journal of African American History, and Slavery and Abolition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Martha S. Jones as our speaker for this evening.
I'm not going to ask what the sigh was, but I was tired just listening to you read off that list. But I want to thank Dr. Wargs very much for the cold call and for arranging for me to be here on what I understand is a very distinguished tradition here. And I'm honored very much to be a part of it. I think I warned you that I would take some liberties with my time tonight. This is one of the very first times I've been in front of more than a handful of human beings in my own family at a podium, no less, for a long time. And I think, like a lot of us, as we come out of our isolation, as we come out of our cocoons, as we come out of a long time with our own thoughts, this felt like an important occasion for me to try and gather some of my thoughts. And over the last 2 years, the subject of my conversation with you tonight, and that subject is democracy, has changed, has grown strained, has, I think, even become urgent. And so I hope you'll indulge me as I talk through the question of democracy through my own work. And I'll end up talking about some of the work we're doing at Johns Hopkins around our own history as an example of perhaps how to bring history to bear on the pressing concerns of democracy in our own time, coming out of the proverbial ivory tower and into the streets and the neighborhoods and the community of Baltimore, where we live and we work. So thank you so much for the opportunity and for some room to experiment a little bit this evening. So as you've heard, I am a historian of American democracy in a sense. I am a historian of Black Americans in democracy. And if perhaps once upon a time, that specialty, that subfield, African American studies, might have been thought to be a sidebar, a footnote, a question when it comes to understanding American democracy, I think it's fair to say today that as someone who indeed works on Black Americans in democracy, those of us who do this work sit very much at the center of not only the study, but the life of democracy. And one of the questions that I often get asked is something like, what do the lessons of the past teach us about today? What does the past allow us to practice going forward as a troubled, challenged democracy at a crossroads? And for a long time, I really avoided that question. It's not really a historian's question at all. Historians, unlike political scientists, historians do not predict or anticipate the future. We don't create models that we expect to be replicated out into some long future. No, in fact, we are mostly backwards looking creatures, explaining the past and resisting the overly simplistic notion that somehow from the past you can predict or understand or anticipate a future. So for a long time, I avoided that question. And yet here we are in 2022, when I think it's fair to say that among us, among Americans, but not only Americans, there are tremendous doubts, questions, and I think in some quarters, even fear about the prospect, the future, the possibility for this democracy going forward. And as that question has become more urgent in a general sense, but urgent in the rooms where I find myself, whether it's a classroom or a lecture hall, in the lecture hall, right? Which is so cool, right? That you're in a lecture hall, in a lecture hall. That's an insider joke here at Towson, I guess. But in the lecture hall, in the seminar room, the urgency is palpable, and it has felt, for me, well timed for historians to be more courageous, be more deliberate, and to begin to talk about where we think the lessons from the past might be for the present and for the future. So that's where I want to go in my time with you this evening. And where I think I'm arriving is in a long look at the history of American democracy and how it has been fought for, struggled over, insisted upon by Black Americans. The tradition that most surfaces for me is the tradition of debate. It is of disagreement. It is of contest and strife. Our democracy is not, as the great Dr. Martin Luther King said when he echoed abolitionist Theodore Parker, right, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Barack Obama, you remember him. You remember him, young people, yes. Barack Obama borrows from the US Constitution. He anticipates progress for this nation that, as he often put it, was on the path to a more perfect union. For me, what these kinds of sweeping characterizations of American democracy elide, what they gloss over, is that out across the nearly 250 years of this nation, okay, maybe 400 plus if you're a 1619 project subscriber, as I some days am, what has characterized this nation is not progress, it is debate. Debate over fundamental questions, fundamental precepts, fundamental facets of a democracy. And in my work, two questions have most pointedly arisen. One is the question of citizenship, and the other, the question of voting rights. And I'm going to talk a little bit from those histories today. So when we look at how citizenship and voting rights have changed over time, these two kind of foundational facets of our democracy, we discover have always generated debate, continue to generate debate. And that may be what a historian has to say, is that we can anticipate that we will continue to do democracy in precisely that way. So rather than fall back, I think, on adages about our journey is circular or being destined to repeat the past, or even the backlash analysis, I hope that in some of what I say this evening, you might appreciate how context over the character of our body politic, how those challenges have met every generation of Americans. And history strongly suggests that our distinct tradition, and indeed our future, is very much like our origins, will play out on that vexed sort of terrain. So I mentioned two sorts of histories that I've worked on, and I want to briefly sketch them, if only to help you see the ways in which, for a historian like me, someone who really is deeply wedded to the study of the past for its own sake, for its own merit, not because I think I'm positioning myself to comment on the present, that somehow in the work on Black Americans and democracy, we wind up commenting on the present. Black history, the Black past is all too present in the 21st century. The debates that have animated that past are still our debates today. So in 2018, I published a book called Birthright, Citizens. I was interested in that book when I began it a very long time ago in challenging the way historians had told the history of citizenship in the United States, largely in early America, by bracketing out Black people altogether. When I started that study, the wisdom among historians was that in fact citizenship was not a salient, an important, a relevant, a critical question in early America, that citizenship had only arisen as an issue in America with the Civil War, with slavery's abolition, and the question of then the future of some 4 million plus formerly enslaved people. That was the received wisdom. And I just wasn't sure. I was enough of a student of the early Black press, for example, and I knew that time by time, I encountered folks who were talking long before the Civil War about the problem of citizenship for Black Americans. I knew that long before the infamous Dred Scott case, in which US Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that no Black person could be a citizen of the United States, that was 1857, that long before that, Black Americans had been talking about, advocating, and wrestling with citizenship. So I started this study to set the record straight for historians. Dred Scott was not as consequential or as definitive a decision as we had thought it was in the 19th century. Rather than citizenship having been a non-issue or one that only took on relevance after the Civil War, my goal was to show us how there was a long and old history of struggles over citizenship, and that Black folks were right at the center of those debates. And I did in a book. I was able to go back to the earliest decades of the 19th century to visit places like abolitionist societies and the so-called colored conventions of early America, literary societies, the early Black press. And lo and behold, the debates were everywhere. They were spirited, they were pointed, they were learned, and they were aiming long before Dred Scott, long before the Civil War, to make the case that Black Americans too were citizens of the United States pursuant to the Constitution. And the book was a success. Right? I mean, it's to say, I persuaded at least some of my colleagues that the history wasn't as we had understood it. And that there was a new and an early chapter in the history of American citizenship, and that Black Americans, particularly formerly enslaved people, free Black Americans, had been the engines of citizenship in early America. Terrific. Now, as a historian, when you do that, you get to sit down, right? You get to sit down and say, my work here is done, but not so fast. This book came out in 2018. And I'll remind you what was afoot in 2018. It was a president of the United States and a White House that were taking aim at the very birthright citizenship principle that Black Americans had fought for so concertedly for many decades until the 14th Amendment finally makes that principle part of the Constitution. The president and his agents were, it appeared, preparing themselves to do away with birthright citizenship. They didn't quite know how. They weren't really sure how to go about doing that. But as we have learned, that might not necessarily get in the way. And all of a sudden, I became someone to whom many sorts of people wanted to talk to, because in order to really sink your teeth into this 21st century debate about birthright citizenship, at least some folks thought they needed to understand the origins, the beginning, where that story started. Why was the White House targeting birthright citizenship? Well, it was a facet of a broader challenge to vilification of demonization of immigrant Americans, right? So here, the idea is that if you do away with birthright citizenship, now children born in the United States to non-citizen parents would no longer automatically by birth, like it is today, be citizens of the United States. And I wind up talking to lawmakers, I wind up talking to immigrant communities, I wind up talking to advocates, and I begin to discover what it feels like to be a historian of early America and to have something to say definitely about the present, but even about the future. Because before I'm done, I hear myself defending the birthright principle and the democratic impulse that it embodied when it indeed, with one clause of the Constitution, made unequivocally more than 4.5 million Black American citizens of the United States. So already my mind is beginning to change, and I'm being drawn out of my comfort zone, but in important ways as a historian. While I was doing that kind of talking and speaking and thinking out loud with people about citizenship, I was working on a book about voting rights, in particular, the place of Black American women in the struggle for voting rights in the United States. I picked up that subject because I knew that in 2020, we were going to celebrate, or at least we were going to mark the anniversary, 100 years since the 19th Amendment to the Constitution had become law, the so-called women's suffrage amendment. And signs were that if we weren't deliberate as historians about telling and foregrounding and putting on the table the history of Black women and their role in the struggle for voting rights, that they might get overlooked. This came clear to me when New York City, my hometown, planned for a monument to honor the early women's suffragists from New York. The plan was to install a monument in New York City's Central Park and to unveil it on August 26, 2020, 100 years to the day since the 19th Amendment had become part of the Constitution. Sounds like an amazing idea. It turned out Central Park had no monuments to living women at all. There were allegorical women, there were fictional women, Alice in Wonderland, but there were no so it was a very ambitious undertaking. But when the plans for the monument were revealed, I discovered the problem that I just described about approaching this anniversary. The proposal was to include two figures on that monument. Maybe these names will ring a bell for some of you. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two women who had long been associated with the movement for women's rights and women's suffrage, two New Yorkers from upstate. But there was something missing in the 21st century, wasn't there? How was it possible that two middle-class white women would represent the whole of the story of women's struggles for the votes, especially in a state that had also birthed Sojourner Truth? Sojourner Truth, formerly enslaved woman who takes the national stage in support of women's rights before either Stanton or Anthony, from upstate New York as well, appeared to them in many important ways. Truth was missing from the monument. And there was a dust up, there were public hearings, and I invite you, I haven't seen it myself because COVID, but I hear, and I've seen on YouTube, so it must be true, there is a monument today in Central Park, and it includes Stanton and Anthony and Sojourner Truth. So here, I knew when I was writing about Black women in the vote that I did have something to say about the present, particularly something to say about how we were going to remember the story of the 19th Amendment. What I could not have anticipated is what we all know played out before our very eyes in 2020, that fall in the election cycle. Black women, political candidates, a record, let me get the number right, 130 Black women in 2020 run for Congress. It's a record-shattering number. Joe Biden vets 6 Black women as he searches for a running mate, and he chooses one of them, Senator Kamala Harris. Behind the scenes in the Biden-Harris campaign are Black women everywhere, strategists, communication specialists, speech writers, and more. Black women are running the show behind the scenes, particularly for the Democratic Party in 2020. And probably all of us know what happens that November when it's time to cast ballots. Black American women do, as they have been doing for 100 years, vote as a near block. Upwards of 95% of Black women vote for Biden and Harris, and they move the needle, change the game, and ensure that the Democrats win in 2020. And all of a sudden, I'm back in it, being asked, yes, about the past of Black women in politics and the vote, yes, some about the present, but as I was just asked last night at a League of Women Voters event, what is the future for Black women in American politics? Ask me in the Q&A and I'll answer that for you. But here, what I want to illustrate for you are the ways in which the Black past is so present and so determinative of our future that even a historian like me has been drawn into these discussions and these debates around the question of democracy, where we've been, how we are, and where we might go. I want to shift gears just to draw a picture of a scene, because there is one scene in American political history that I have written into every book I've ever written, I believe, and many other things as well. I want to share it with you because I think it helps me to illustrate some of the lessons, I think, that come out of the study of Black Americans and democracy, lessons that I think continue to serve us well, or at least I hope they will, in the 21st century. So, take you back, way back, it's 1866, spring of 1866. We're in New York City. The Civil War has ended. Slavery has been abolished by way of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And now there is a tremendous question on the front burner for the entire nation, which is, who are the 4 million plus formerly enslaved people in the United States going to be before the law, before the Constitution, in the body politic? This is a question that is consuming Congress in these very months. It is consuming the political parties, and it is consuming an old coalition of activists who have known each other going back now decades, veterans of the movement for women's rights and of the movement to abolish slavery. These allies come back together in the spring of 1866 to found a new organization called the American Equal Rights Association. Why? Because they are ready now to use their ideas and their political savvy to shape the course of this question, right? Of where is American democracy going in the wake of civil war, in the wake of slavery's abolition. They are especially concerned with what are proposed to be two more constitutional amendments that are going to come out of Congress and that are being debated. A 14th Amendment and a 15th Amendment. 14th Amendment that's going to give us birthright citizenship, but also look to punish southern states who deprive voters of, male voters of access to the polls, and a 15th Amendment that is going to expressly prohibit the states from using race as a criteria when meting out voting rights. So these amendments are in the works. This old coalition has a deep interest in the question of the remaking of the body politic, and in particular, who can vote. And this is on the table during their deliberations. There are some pretty remarkable people at this meeting. I've mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who has been at it since the 1840s, agitating both for the end of slavery, albeit gently, and much more pointedly for the rights of women. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most notorious of radical abolitionists, a journalist, lecturer, firebrand, and more, and two Baltimoreans. I couldn't resist. Two Baltimoreans. Frederick Douglass, who you know, was born enslaved on the Eastern Shore, who stole himself while being held and bound to labor in Baltimore City. Douglass is here now, a statesman nearly, and someone who is weighing in on the question and the future of Black Americans, the future of voting rights, the future of citizenship. And along with these three is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, raise your hand. Ah, thank you. I got two hands. This is my perfect audience. This is the kind of crowd I have been really dying to speak in front of. And another day, we'll talk about how on earth we don't know who Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is born in Baltimore in 1825. She's raised and educated here by an uncle, William Watkins, who is a minister a civil rights activist, an abolitionist, and a great deal more. She leaves Baltimore to become an educator. She will very quickly try her hand very successfully at poetry and will be a poet all of her life, a prolific one. By the 1850s, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is among a rare breed of American women. She is an anti-slavery lecturer, traveling with men like Douglass and Garrison and many others, looking to bring Americans into the cause of anti-slavery. She will become, as we'll see in a moment, a suffragist, a novelist, and a great deal more. We are overdue in Baltimore, if I might say, editorially, to honor Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So I look forward to seeing you on that occasion too. So Frances Harper is there. And this story has been told over and over and over by historians. Some historians like to tell it because they're trying to figure out who a woman like Elizabeth Cady Stanton was. You know, where was she? Not on women's rights, we know that. She comes to that meeting and advocates for educated suffrage. Her view is that white middle-class women should get the vote before the unwashed and the uneducated former slaves. So we study this scene to understand her, to understand an origin point for a troubled mix of feminism and anti-Black racism that will run through the women's suffrage movement. It has some of its origins here, so we study the meeting for that. We sometimes study this meeting depends on how you see him, but to think about Frederick Douglass, why Douglass in the end abandons or steps away from the women's rights that he had long advocated in the years before the Civil War, why he steps back from that and says, in essence, this is the Negro's hour. For Black men, the vote is a matter of life and death, and women can wait, is the implication. We'll come back to it for that. Okay, not everybody comes to it for Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, but I do. Because Harper comes and she is really in this meeting ready to launch a new way of thinking, a new way of organizing, a new way of defining voting rights, doing so from the perspective of Black women. At this meeting, Harper says, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And what she means is that voting rights is a human rights issue. Right? Can't be divvied up along lines of race or sex, and it definitely can't be divvied up in the body of a Black woman along those kinds of terms. So some of us come to this meeting to understand Harper. But I think the thing that we don't appreciate when we study this moment, and I confess, for the many times I have taught and written and thought about this debate, I never thought about it as democracy in action, right? Is actually that's what American democracy is, right? And that part of what we're seeing, as painful as it is, depending on how you see the positions folks take, how disappointing it is, or how visionary it was, that all of that, right, all of that is a necessary facet of American democracy. And Harper, Garrison, and Stanton, and Douglass are people who will come together again and again and again in convention, on the pages of newspapers, in pamphlets and in tracts, from podiums and from pulpits, taking on these debates. And their model, I think, is indeed not always an easy one, not always a compatible one, not even always a successful one, but they tell us something about what democracy looks like, and what we should be asking, I think, of ourselves. So let me say just a few things, and then I'm going to wrap up and we'll have time for questions and comments. I think the first thing I learned from these figures and others like them at this extraordinary moment, right, when the US is about to embark after the Civil War on its first and regrettably very brief effort at an interracial democracy. I think there are things we can learn from these figures. Part of what they all know and what they all practice is democracy as a long game. Democracy is never about that debate in 1866, and nothing about that debate as fraught, as consequential and more as it was, nothing about that debate is the whole of democracy. No election cycle is the whole of democracy. That democracy is a long game, and these are folks who will, many of them, on to the end of the 19th century, as now great elders, continue to show up and to do that work as it needs to be done. That long commitment to democracy. Democracy, I think, means for them staying at the table. This is a terrible moment of betrayal, of disappointment, of falling short, of exposing, right, some of the ugliest facets of these characters. And yet, when we look out over the balance of their public lives, they continue to work together. They continue to build coalition. And so here, there's something about staying at the table, right? Even in the face of the profound disappointments of a moment like that in 1866, when this coalition clashes and fractures. Democracy for them was about always claiming your highest ideals. That wasn't simply about who was going to carry the day at the American Equal Rights Association. It wasn't simply about what went on, whether it was in corridors or back rooms or at dinner, all the ways in which politics gets navigated and negotiated. And those things certainly went on. But when we read the transcript of this meeting, what we discover is that when they get to the podium, the proverbial microphone, these are men and women who speak their highest ideals, who indeed talk to us, right? Not only about how they're going to vote or how this coalition is going to split, but they speak to us about what is democracy, what is equality, what are human rights. And so part of our work, I think, is, yes, to be in the trenches and to do the work in the trenches, but also when we get the microphone to speak our highest ideals and to remind us of those, to hold them up. The last thing is democracy means passing it on. And part of what is extraordinary about all four of the figures that I've mentioned is that they literally have children who pick up the mantle and continue the work, many of them on into the 20th century. That these are folks who understand not only the long game, but how arduous it is for a nation like ours to work at democracy, given how we are born out of strife, given how we are born out of debate, given how we are born out of profound disagreement, that they pass it on. Frances Ellen Watkins, Harper's daughter, Mary, is trained by her mother to be an elocutionist, a special sort of public speaker, so that she can travel the country and promote her ideas. Douglas's sons and daughter will be among those who will work in the campaign for women's votes, even if as their father had for a time set that aside, and so forth. These are folks who are passing it on and preparing next generations to do the work when they are gone. I want to invoke one more great Baltimorean, one of our own time before I close, and that is the recently retired, I guess, head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn Ifill. Ifill is a wonderful talk a few years back about what she calls democracy maintenance. She calls upon us to recognize that the work of democracy is arduous. She is speaking from the trenches of civil rights advocacy in our very own time. But Ifill is a great student of history, even a writer of history from time to time. And she knows, I think, what I'm beginning to discover is that work of democracy maintenance is the work we are charged with doing. It is the work that we have always done. And so I encourage us, invite us to hold on to the examples of great Baltimoreans like Douglas and Watkins, Harper, as we think about our future. I do think they are our models. I do think they show us a way forward, not because they are pointing to a perfect or idealized or ideally just future, but because they understood importantly what it meant to stay at the table and be part of the debate. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to let you tell me what I do next. But thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it.
So now we have about 15 to 20 minutes to ask questions and have a little discussion, sparked by your comments and thoughtful presentation. So, questions?
Comments.
I've got a lot of questions. I don't want to take a whole. I'll ask the question.
Okay.
So I've been thinking a lot lately about the challenges of democracy in terms of just the disagreement. I mean, you're talking about a time where folks disagreed on whether or not other folks even had human rights. And so I've been wrestling with, it's an extraordinary system that could sustain itself with those kinds of disagreements. I mean, we disagree about a lot of stuff today. Can you talk a little bit about just, the ability the capacity of these folks to continue to discuss and debate given such extraordinary disagreements?
Yeah. It's so important, isn't it? And I would say, I think a lot about Francis Harper and Douglas too, as they stand virtually face to face with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is going to promote the subordination of their voting rights with ideas that are clearly informed by and animated by racism. Why do they stay? I think it's a couple of things. And I mean this with all seriousness. Douglas and Harper are individuals who believe many things, but part of what they believe is that they are right. That is to say, not only have they tested their ideas and honed their ideas, sharpened their ideas, debated their ideas, there is a sense in which I think each of them is deeply committed to the project of democracy and the future of democracy. And so in part, they stay at the table because they think they're right. And they're there to persuade, right? And they're there to bring others on board, and to try again. On the other hand, I think that Harper in particular speaks forthrightly about the wrongs to which she has been subjected. She shows up at this meeting, and the first thing she wants to talk about is how she has been disrespected, denigrated, and even strong-armed on streetcars and trains because she's a Black woman, right? And she's not extended the privileges of ladies, those privileges that are reserved for white women. And she challenges Stanton. She challenges the white women at this meeting. She says, you know, have women nothing to do with this, right? You women talk of rights, I speak of wrongs. Right? So she's there. But I think part of what they are doing is making a record that when they show up, when they speak, when they take the podium, when they publish those tracts and pamphlets, when they later on litigate and take cases to the Supreme Court, it is about making the record of what has gone on, what is going on here. It is oftentimes the record of wrongs, but it is that long view. In this respect, I'm a great student, not a great student, I am a student of the Citizens Committee that brought the Plessy versus Ferguson case in the 1890s. So Plessy versus Ferguson is a challenge to Louisiana state law that has now newly required that white and non-white passengers be separated on the streetcars in cities like New Orleans. And Homer Plessy is the named plaintiff in a challenge that goes all the way to the US Supreme Court. But behind Homer Plessy is a citizens committee, a team of folks who have been organizing and who organized this litigation, this challenge to the Louisiana Separate Car Act. And among them is a man named Rudolph Dedune. And they lose, right? They lose terribly at the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court says separate is equal by virtue of the Constitution. And so Louisiana may, if it chooses, separate Black and white passengers on streetcars. They lose. But what Dedune says is, we knew we were going to lose, right? We were good students of the court. And by the time we get there, the record is clear that the court is not going to side with us, is not going to use the Constitution, not going to use the 14th Amendment to strike down segregation, and to the contrary. But that wasn't our purpose. Our purpose was to make a record of what happened here, right? To make a record of what happened here, and to make that record indelibly, right, on the pages of the US Supreme Court reporter, so that the next generations would know what happened here, right? That we would force the state to show its hand, to make its arguments full-throatedly. Well, this is exactly, right, the record that men like Charles Hamilton Houston and another great Baltimorean, Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, the first Black woman federal judge, and the great foremother of Justice, it's the first time I'm going to say it out loud, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. That record, right, is picked up by those brilliant advocates who bring us all the way to the overturning of Plessy in Brown. So I think there's something about making the record here and make it publicly and making it unequivocally. And in order to do that, you have to show up, right? You have to be at the table. You have to be in the rooms. Yeah.
We have some questions from Zoom.
Oh, sorry.
Question is, while doing research on the law, did anything come up about the most Black women
I'm sorry, say, I apologize.
While doing research in New York, did anything come up about the lost Black communities coming from Black parks?
Right. Seneca Village in New York, which is a place I know a little bit about because in my first book, I wrote about the history of the AME Zion Church, which has its origins in New York City and its roots in that Seneca Village community that is indeed disappeared in the interests of the scheme that becomes ultimately Central Park. I hope I'm getting this right, that today, when you visit the site, there are now, for the first time, markers and monuments, I'm getting a nod, thank you, that now tell the story of the community at Seneca Village and its destruction by New York City in the 19th century. It's such an important story. So yes, it's a park that is indeed being remade and Black history surfacing to importantly, I think, remake Central Park. So thanks to the person on Zoom. I'm looking right in the camera now. Thank you for that. And I think I saw a hand. I'm just gonna repeat a version of the question, which is, you know, the observation is, right, Black folk not really subscribing to the platforms or the philosophies of either of the political parties, might be registered Democrats, but really not committed to the party's vision or the party's principles. Is that a disadvantage or an advantage somehow in American politics? And it's such an old and important question that, in fact, I think Black Americans have been debating even before, right, Black men get access to the polls after the Civil War in important numbers. This question about whether Black Americans should be independent, remain independent of the parties, or if there is power to be gained. So two examples, you know, in New York, at the end of the 19th century, this moment, the terrible moment of Plessy versus Ferguson, the rise of Jim Crow, disenfranchisement, lynching, segregation. There is an important movement based in New York, folks who advocate powerfully that both political parties have betrayed Black Americans, that neither political party is standing with Black Americans as that interracial democracy experiment that was Reconstruction is being violently crushed by white supremacy. And that view is Black Americans should stay out of both parties because neither party has really stood up, and they need to exercise their political influence, their political muscle independently of the parties and challenge both parties to earn the Black vote rather than as many Black Americans had in those years after the Civil War, rather than be habitually loyal to the Republican Party. So that's one view. On the other hand, fast forward to the 1920s, not so far afterward, in Chicago, and somebody like Ida B. Wells, right? Ida Wells, the great anti-lynching advocate, journalist, and suffragist, by 1920 has organized Black women in Chicago. And Wells's view is not only do Black women need to register and cast their ballots, they need to join the Republican Party, use their numbers to win their seats at the table, to influence the platform, to influence the choice of candidates, and to move the needle on election day. And in Chicago, Ida Wells will be among this community of Black women who will move the needle and send the first Black man to Congress in 1928, Oscar de Priest, since Reconstruction. Because so it is an open debate, an important debate. We are the inheritors, right, of this debate, right, which is how to see ourselves in relationship to political parties. And so so we should be neither surprised, I think, nor perturbed, right, that we are still debating that question. It was a live question then, and I think it's still, for many folks, a live question today. Remember the Garvey movement, right? Folks who step away from party politics altogether, right, and adopt a Pan-African vision for the future, and for how they're going to mobilize and organize, stepping away from party politics altogether. I think we've always understood what an important question that was. And so I think we can own it, right, rather than imagine it somehow out of bounds or new. Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question.
Got another Zoom question.
Harper was an extremely popular poet during the 19th century. She worked on the Underground Railroad, but many people still associate that with Harriet Tubman. Why do you believe she is not widely known for her?
I would, if the Zoomer was in the room, I would want to know your answer, because I've been asking myself this. Now, Harper is better remembered in Philadelphia, which was her adopted home city. There's a marker at what became her residence there. I want to say something cheeky like sexism, anyone? you know, which is to say, not to say that Douglass shouldn't be importantly remembered, but how Douglass and even Tubman have eclipsed Harper is interesting to me, and I'll take a stab at it. And you'll tell me what you think. And now I'm speaking about Baltimore and why Baltimore. Harper is hard for Baltimore to remember. You know, Tubman was an enslaved woman. Douglass too, right, fits a mold. But Harper is born free in this city. She's part of what becomes the largest community of free Black people in the United States in the decades before the Civil War, in the third largest city in the United States, which is to say, Harper is someone who is of a people, and of a people who were not enslaved, who were born free, who lived and worked, built institutions, made politics, family and community and more right here in Baltimore. And I think it is hard for this city to remember that origin story for Black folks in this city. That it is not all a story of up from slavery, which we have come to incorporate into narratives like that of the Underground Railroad and more. Harper is something else altogether. She is indeed a poet, is a very young woman and an accomplished one. She is an eloquent and powerfully effective public speaker. She is an educator, a suffragist, a temperance advocate, a novelist, and more. I think that is hard for this city to incorporate into its sense of self.
We have one more question from the audience.
I think I've got one here. Hi. That's my fault. The question was, the question I had invited earlier, which is, what is the future of Black women in politics? I'll tell you where I think the debate is, where the trouble is. And it was very interesting because it came up last night at this meeting. I was on the Eastern Shore in Chestertown, the League of Women Voters. And this is something they think about a lot as nonpartisan advocates for women in politics. I think it is, do you remember in 2020, after it becomes fairly apparent that Biden and Harris have prevailed, it takes a few days, but we finally get there. It's long before January 6th and all that madness. And so there is a moment of kind of elation, at least for those who had supported the Biden-Harris ticket. And there was a hashtag, Thank Black Women. Do you remember that? Thank Black Women. And I had friends who were putting up their Venmo on Twitter, like, buy me a drink, thank Black women. But I think the real test is whether now we are prepared for Black women to lead. It is one thing, right, to thank Black women. It is another thing to fall in line, right, and now let those women, right, who have won their seats in Congress, who have been elected Vice President of the United States, who have been confirmed as justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. Will we allow those women to lead? Will we follow them, right? Do we believe, right, deeply enough in the century-long brilliance that Black women have brought to American politics, such that we lived 2020 as we did? Will now folks let them lead? And I don't think that's a given. I don't think that's a given. I think that is exactly where we are. That is exactly the challenge. 2022 election cycle will have double the number of Black women running for Congress, for example, as ran just 2 years ago. Can't even begin to quantify the state and local offices for which Black women will run. And the question is, will we let Black women lead?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for your questions. This has been a wonderful discussion. Very thoughtful. I got a lot of questions running through my mind, but we're out of time. I do want to thank you. Before we thank you, I want to acknowledge Dean of College of Liberal Arts has arrived.
Hi, Dean.
He's especially excited about your lecture because we have an ongoing conversation in the college around democracy. And so this is a perfect fit into this our ongoing discourse around democracy in the college and thinking about wrestling with notions of democracy. So we really thank you for being right on point with what we've been thinking about. Please join me in thanking Dr. Jones once again. I'd like to acknowledge all the folks who joined us through Zoom. I think maybe Dr. Anthony, one of our retired faculty, is on Zoom. She actually written a lot about Francis Watkins Harper, so I was excited about that. I'm sure she was clapping when we were talking about it. If you would like, please join us for a short light reception on the second floor of the College of Liberal Arts. We have some snacks and hors d'oeuvres. I know the students, we got like free food, so please join us.